In the middle of the grand hall, there was a young guy sitting on an expensive throne, wearing expensive armor and looking very confident. His nickname was X, and he was so rich that he could afford anything he wanted. From the most expensive equipment that cost as much as a sports car in real life, to buying potions that cost more than a college education in real life. And all for the sake of self-assertion and the desire to become a real king of players. At first everything went well, and he with the help of his loyal team achieved success and held the throne of king for more than 2 years. But everything changed in an instant. And if someone were to ask him now about his days in Lin Online, he would want to punch that person. Because now he had to work hard every day to keep up with all the orders. 2 years ago, his team had rebelled against him, wanting to take away his title as the strongest monarch. And even though it's been over 2 years now, his resentment hasn't gone anywhere. Even more, it probably won't go away even decades later. The mere memory of it all made him angry, and he clutched the rag he had been wiping the stove with. And all because the game that had been his life and his favorite place to play had simply disappeared in an instant, just like everything he had achieved during his time playing in it. And it was his former team that made him leave that game. Even now, standing over the stove and dusting himself off, after remembering what had happened then, his hand involuntarily clenched with anger all over again. The people he had started out playing with, the people he trusted the most, had stabbed him in the back in a sneaky way. The reason, as it often is, was only one, and it was money. After all, there was no one who wasn't jealous of his enormous income. And the unsuspecting monarch became the perfect target for betrayal. All his friends in the game chose money over him. And after all, he was the strongest monarch in the history of this Lin Online game. But they still really wanted to get him out of their way and prepared a whole plan for this. And they all worked quickly and cleanly, because then he realized everything only after he died in the game. And lost all his precious items. The system notified him that he would be revived and moved to the nearest city, where he could start the game over again. Then he dearly learned one important lesson: never trust anyone. The only one he could count on and rely on was himself. With a trembling hand he could barely let go of the mouse he was so used to. Then he promised himself that he would eat it all himself and regain the top spot again. But as it turned out, starting all over again was not an easy task, and after several failed attempts he realized that he would never succeed. After all, his current level does not correspond to his goal. In addition, during the quiet time spent as a monarch, his fingers had aged and weakened, and now fast control of the character was not possible for him. Plus the interference from his old friends who had established themselves as monarchs made things even worse. He could no longer enjoy the game at all. It was time to stop and give up. Our hero had to leave his once favorite game. He sold his account and used the money he earned to open his current store, where he was now forced to work every day in the sweat of his brow. Well, that was how he made his living, but now looking back he thought that it would have been better if he hadn't handed out his income from account to them so stupidly. But now it was just empty regrets, and there was nothing more he could do about it. Now all he had to do was cook the chicken and pass the finished orders to the customers. After the day was over, he exhaled in relief and stretched his strained back, praising himself for a good job. He could finally relax and opened the refrigerator to grab a can of soda. Taking it, he sat down at one of the tables in the middle of his store and just sat there for a few minutes, contemplating his plight. But then he got tired of just sitting there, so he decided to turn on the TV and watch the news. But instead of the boring evening news, there were 2 anchors discussing the release of a new game. They were saying that starting tomorrow, Fate, which everyone had been so eagerly waiting for, will begin official service. And now finally everyone who has been waiting so eagerly for its release will be able to play it. Our hero listened incredulously and sipped his soda. What was it to him that some new game came out? He had enough to do here. He leisurely finished his soda and was about to turn off the TV, thinking that if he was 5 years younger, he would have tried his hand at this game right after its release. But suddenly, the news said that famous players were also showing notable interest before the opening of Fate. Especially prominent among them was the War Machine Guild from Lin Online, who were our protagonist's team. Upon hearing the name of their guild, he immediately tensed up. The hosts were discussing their interview in which the leaders of this guild had very openly expressed their determination regarding this new game. Now the evening immediately stopped being so boring. The hosts even called out their nicknames, Kaimus, Diesel, and Sorceress. Although most people already knew them. All of them were determined to take leadership positions in Fate, just like in Lin Online. Hearing their names, our hero gritted his teeth in anger. At first he thought that if it were up to him, he would immediately start playing this game and see if it was really his destiny to get revenge or not. But then after cooling down a bit, he sadly bowed his head realizing that none of this would work. After all, it's been over 2 years since he stopped playing games. And he also has to run his business. As he searched for excuses why he couldn't start playing again, the news anchors continued to praise the game, which they said had endless content and tons of players. But on top of all this there was another interesting detail: in order to enter this game you needed a special device, a capsule diver. One of the presenters explained that capsule divers can be purchased on the Fate website. And if anyone has any difficulties in using the website, they can contact Fate user support and they will be happy to provide all the help they can. To find out more, our hero immediately started searching the internet for information about this device. As it turned out, it was an advanced virtual reality device that allowed you to fully immerse yourself in the world of the game. Our protagonist had heard about virtual reality before, but before that everything, including the virtual world itself and especially the control in it, was cramped and unnatural. But the developers of the device convinced that now there is a new era, when players will control their characters with the help of brainwaves and will be able to fully into the beautiful world. Such information surprised our hero. After all, it changed everything and meant that manual control would not be used, and now even he with his weak and slow fingers would be able to compete with the other players on equal terms. This was his chance to prevail over Fate, and he clutched the empty soda can in his hand with a confident smile, mentally telling his future opponents to run while they had the chance. After all, he was going to remind them all again the difference between a true monarch and a bunch of trash. In such an elevated mood, he returned to his apartment and decided to order the device immediately. But what was his disappointment when he discovered that all of these outrageously expensive consoles were sold out on the first day. The console itself cost as much as 10 million won, plus additional services for a quick start cost several $100,000 more. Our hero wondered what he should do, as the next shipment of consoles was due in 4 weeks. He decided that first of all he needed to make a startup capital, and for this he would have to fry a lot of chicken to keep up with the others. Because each fried chicken would become a purchased item and level. Our hero hoped that he would succeed and he could get back to the top again. After a month of hard work, he finally bought himself a new generation console and all the preparations were completed. He finally started to get inside the console, which was huge and looked more like a CAT scanner than a game console. He lay down inside and put on his glasses. The moment had finally come. And first of all he needed to adapt perfectly in virtual reality. He thought it had been 2 years since he had played, but suddenly the space in front of him began to fill with blue pixels. And with a flash of bright blue light, he entered a new world and received the first notification: login completed. Immediately after that, an incredibly realistic blue sky with the sun was above him. His game character was lying peacefully in the middle of the lawn. It felt like he was coming to after a deep sleep and the sun was blinding him. Finally, he stood up, shielding himself from the sun's 2 bright rays. A beautiful forest with mountains and a waterfall appeared before his eyes. It was called the Forest of Beginning. It was all incredible for our hero, and he could not believe how real everything was around him. Further appeared another information window from the system that notified the player that the creation of the character is complete and asked to choose a nickname. Here our hero had no doubts. He was going to choose the same name as in the last game, X. But our hero was not confused and decided that he should not be frightened by these big words, and right now he should have decided to reveal the truth behind that legend even if he had never heard about Gourmet King before. But before all that, he should have finally eaten, so he opened the inventory. There he selected rye bread, which immediately materialized in his hand. X looked at the bread and thought that due to his new skills, this bread must have some hidden flavor. So he tasted it without delay. He felt how soft and warm the bread was, and he thought he could taste the feelings of care the farmer put into sowing the weed for it. There was also the notice that the viscosity that permeates the rye bread had been absorbed by his body. Now he didn't understand how the rye bread could be so delicious. All this besides the taste had another plus: for eating the bread his stamina attributes were increased by 30 points and his strength by 2 points. Now our hero could increase his different attributes just by eating a variety of food. He smiled as it gave him an undeniable advantage over the other players. And now he was sorry that he had said bad things about this class before, because it opened up limitless possibilities. But he had run out of bread, so he decided to walk around the neighborhood looking for something edible. On one of the trees at the edge of the forest he noticed bright red fruits. It was red berries, and thanks to the heavenly palate skill he had gotten a boost to his stamina and mana as soon as he tasted it. Red berries were very sweet tasting, but there was still one more thing that our hero needed to clarify. What would happen if he ate the same berry again? Would it give him bonuses? They still tasted great, but unfortunately he did not get any bonuses to the characteristics. So he had to look for new treats, and our hero turned his gaze to the creatures nearby. Poor big-horned deers did not suspect what awaited them next, but their fate was already decided, because they looked too tasty for our hero. And since eating the same things didn't work, it was time to change the menu, in which the main dish for the moment would be deer. X drew his sword and prepared his killer precision strike. The deer sensed the danger and started to run away, but it was already too late. And our hero ended all his suffering with one blow. He was wondering what the deer meat would taste like. Now he had the opportunity to find out, because from the killed deer he was able to collect several items, including meat. Thanks to his skills, this meat was of the highest quality and tasted softer and better than normal meat. However, because the meat was raw, it recovered 50% less satiety. He also got a soft deer skin. It was of the highest quality and was more valuable than regular deer skin. Selling this hide to merchants slightly increased their favorability to the player. In addition, equipment made from this hide was supposed to increase dexterity by 2 or 3 points. Our hero was pleased and surprised at the same time that after killing one deer he got 2 rare items at once. At this rate he will be able to earn a lot of real money just by hunting these deer. Well, it's time for the main course, and our hero is going to hunt all the remaining deer. The poor guys started to run away, but unfortunately there was no chance to save them, and the hero advised them to wait right there and not to stretch the pleasure. Having finished with the deer hunt, our hero returned to Narvel Castle and visited the street of stores. He entered the store of the merchant Reuben, and when the latter asked him what had brought him here, X cheerfully replied that he had brought a dozen deerskins for sale. But the merchant cooled his ardor a bit, saying that he was sorry, but he wouldn't be able to offer him a good price on them due to the high level of supply of this item from the players. Our hero expected such a response, because any newcomer started with deer hunting, so he immediately placed 10 soft deer skins on the counter. The merchant's mood immediately changed, and he began to examine the goods with astonishment, not believing his eyes. He did not understand how someone could get so many such high-quality things. The merchant immediately asked if he had any more of these skins. After all, such high-quality goods were in high demand among the nobles, and he could offer a very good price for such skins. X was even a little surprised at the merchant's insistence. He replied that he could bring more skins, but first he would like to know how much the merchant would pay him for them. As soon as the question of price came up, Reuben's fervor immediately cooled down and he awkwardly asked how much our hero wanted to get for the skins. X's answer surprised him, because he wanted as much as 1 gold coin for each skin. This price was too high for the merchant. Our hero deliberately named a high price and planned to bargain and offer additional conditions in exchange for a better price, because negotiations and inner sense were very important in any business. So our hero offered the trader that if he agreed to such a price, then later he would bring him as many skins as he wanted, and to confirm his words he got 30 more soft deer skins. He had learned to haggle so skillfully for 2 years in his store selling fried chicken. Reuben couldn't resist and agreed to the offered price of 1 gold coin per piece. But, he also had a counter-condition in exchange for such a high price. Next time our hero, if he had skins to sell, would have to come to this store to sell them. When they reached an agreement together, the merchant handed X 30 gold coins. After earning his first money in this game, our hero went for a walk around Narvel. As he walked down the street, he wondered what he should do next. He had the idea to exchange some gold coins for real money to pay for his living in the real world, and also he should have bought himself a good set of armor. But these gold coins were not enough for a good set of armor, and he needed to keep finding and getting good items and selling them. For that he decided to visit bison habitat at Narvel Fields to hunt for ox. But there was another player there, and judging by his clothes he belonged to the priest class. He sadly watched the ox and wondered if it was even possible to reach the goal of being in the top 100 in 6 months. Especially when you don't have any connections, talent, or money. The other weak players seemed to have already given up and were no longer trying to raise their level. He wondered if maybe he should have given up too. But suddenly his attention was caught by a movement in front of him. It was our hero who was carrying out another merciless massacre for the local fauna in the process of extracting resources to sell. That priest couldn't believe his eyes. He did not understand what that guy was doing, destroying one after another. And in fact, how he, being in the armor of a novice, could so easily deal with so many ox at a time. But after seeing his skills and confident movements, he had an idea to use this talented player to raise his level. For that, all he needed to do was to form a team with him. This was his only chance to level up, and he wasn't going to miss it. So he jumped off a small cliff and headed towards our hero. But he killed the last ox and for some reason froze in place. And before the priest could run and shout to him, he began to leave the game. Above X appeared the corresponding system inscription, and he began to disappear from this game world. The poor priest was so close to his chance, but his shout, "Wait," seemed never to be heard. Such bad luck brought tears to the poor man's eyes. Our hero, on the other hand, returned to the real world in his apartment. He opened the lid of the console, which was like a sarcophagus, and leisurely climbed up for the first time in hours. Taking off his VR goggles, he remembered that, right before he exited the game, he heard someone calling him from behind. He instinctively turned around, wondering if it was all real or was it all his imagination. But there was no point in thinking about it for too long, and he dismissed all unnecessary thoughts and went to take a shower. Quickly ate a quick meal of convenience food. And filled the biogel container. Having made all the current and necessary preparations, our hero was ready to dive back into the game world. But before that he decided to read a little about the existing ranks in the game, because he heard that they are quite important and he wanted to know which of the ranks was the most accessible and easy to get. He turned on the Fate Tip radio on his phone and started listening, and he found out that you could get a rank by hunting 100 monsters of a higher level than players. But there was one thing: monsters killed in a team with someone did not count. Such conditions fully suited our hero, because for him to kill 100 monsters solo was an easy task. He with a confident smile put on and turned on the VR headset. Immersing himself in the world of the game, he thought that such a challenge would be an easy piece of cake for a former professional gamer like him. The closest town to the Forest of Beginners was Narvel Castle, and its high walls stood out from the surrounding landscape. Inside the walls was a nice town with many stores, guilds and quests. It had everything a budding adventurer needed. The forest east of Narvel Castle was usually where many newbies would gather, hoping to gather their first resources from hunting and gathering. But this time, something was wrong, and a group of beginners stared questioningly at the clearing in front of them. One guy among them commented in surprise that this dude was still doing this and asked the others how many hours it had been. He was wondering, is it really a person or could it be a bot? But another guy answered him that it seemed to him that it couldn't be a bot, since it was a brainwave recognition game. Meanwhile, in the clearing in front of them ran a lot of creatures called stupid tubi, which looked like a mixture of an egg and a chick. It turned out that it was our protagonist who was mercilessly exterminating the population of stupid tubi for several hours in a row in order to earn experience and raise his level. Thanks to his excellent concentration and effort, the game allowed him to regenerate his stamina. It was one of the mechanics for accelerated pumping of beginners. Also, after a certain number of hits he could activate his passive skill swing, which he could use to kill all the stupid tubies in the clearing at once. Immediately after using it, he once again raised his level. After that, he summoned the information window to see his characteristics and attributes. By killing defenseless stupid tubies for hours on end, he was able to reach level 5. Also, he wasn't just doing this for the experience, but also to practice controlling his character. And now that the controls were familiar enough for him, he was starting to get used to his character's movements. Now he was ready to move on to the next location to hunt. He was a whole month behind the other top players and he needed to catch up with them as fast as possible. To do so, he had come far enough and another clearing spread out before him, flooded by the rays of the setting sun. At last he decided to stop here, for he had already come quite a long way from that forest of beginners. He immediately spotted a deer in the clearing and realized that he seemed to have come far enough, and this was exactly what he needed. X drew his sword and was about to hunt all the monsters he could find in this forest. First to go was that poor deer, which he killed with one precise swing, gaining much more experience than he had gotten for stupid Tubi. But immediately after killing the deer, he saw a notification that the hunger bar was below 10%. Moreover, his character's movements immediately slowed down and his stamina regeneration stopped. He exhaled tiredly. Such game mechanics seemed annoying to him. What genius had come up with the idea of adding a hunger system to the game? Our hero hadn't expected to start feeling hungry so early in the game. Now he will have to distract himself from advancing his character and constantly looking for food. But even though he was basically in the middle of a place like Mount Jumgang, so he could try to find something edible here. He decided to check his inventory and there were a few warm loaves of bread in there before he set off. So he had food for the first time. He took out the warm bread and was about to eat it. But suddenly something flew near him with lightning speed and knocked the bread out of his hands. The bread fell on the grass. However, as soon as our hero looked at the place where it should have fallen, it was no longer there. Something incomprehensible was happening. How could the thief be so quick and brazen? Our hero looked at him judgmentally and asked him how he dared. But the stranger did not pay any attention to him and began to eat the bread greedily. While he was enjoying his food and exclaiming how delicious it was, X did not give up trying to find out who he was. And even thought how elaborate the game was that it even had beggars like him. An information window appeared above the stranger, but even it said that this was an unknown man. However, the appearance of the window above him meant that this man was not a user, but an NPC. Things were very strange then, because NPCs never do anything for nothing, and if they go or do something, there must be a reason for it. Our hero decided to take advantage of this and see what would happen. He assumed the man was hungry and offered him another bread if he wanted it. His face lit up with happiness, he couldn't believe his luck. X convinced him that he could eat as much as he wanted. The man walked over to him and took another bread, telling him that it had been over 300 years since he had eaten the way he did now. X incredulously interrogated 300 years. The man replied that no matter how far he would be forced to go on his journey, he could not let this valuable item be wasted. He wanted to give our hero something for his kindness. X had already started dreaming about what good item he would receive as a reward. He hoped it would be some kind of weapon, equipment, treasure map or something like that. But the stranger just handed him a round blue candy like pearl. And said it was all he had and he was asking to accept the gift. The information window said it was an unknown candy from an unknown man. Our hero was a little disappointed. He had exchanged 2 loaves of bread for one small ugly candy. At first glance it didn't look like an equal exchange. But he still had hoped that this candy had some hidden effects. So he decided to just try it out to experience the effects for himself. Even though common sense told him that it was probably a trap, he still wanted to try it. After all, even if it was, he was still a newbie with no way to die after losing all items and skills. As soon as he took the candy in his hands and looked at it closely, it glowed with a strange light. And cracked in the middle, filling all the space around with the infinity of space. Immediately the hero's eyes rolled back and he began to fall into a strange dream. As his unconscious body began to slowly settle on the grass in the middle of the clearing. The stranger expected this and stopped being more like a common beggar and said goodbye to the hero that he hoped to meet him again someday. Our hero found himself in the middle of a spacious hall at the table, which was full of various exquisite dishes. And a lot of fresh fruit. And the smell of it all was simply divine. In front of him was a royal banquet with candles, everything looked fresh and hot as if it had just been cooked. But as soon as he tried to touch the food, it was all just an illusion. Which seeped through his hand and was nothing more than a pretty picture with a pleasant smell. Behind his back was the same beggar and it seemed he was cooking something. Hearing a noise behind him, X turned around to find out what it was. He was surprised to find the very same man who was concentrating on cooking something. Our hero couldn't believe that that guy could be a chef. And it seemed that that man was waiting for someone. Suddenly the man spoke, saying that many times the sun has set and darkness has fallen. Many times the seasons changed, time passed and the man he was waiting for did not come. Suddenly he stopped talking and stopped cooking. And began to stare at our protagonist. So intently that it seemed he was waiting for him. That man's eyes shone brightly and the infinity of space was reflected in it again. Looking into his eyes, our hero immediately came to his senses from this strange dream. It was already night in the game and after such a dream he had a headache. He wondered if it was all just a dream or if everything was real. But all his doubts were dispelled the next moment when an information window appeared in front of him. Which told him that he had obtained the hidden class, Heavenly Gourmet. Our hero was surprised. Until this moment he didn't even know that hidden classes existed in this game. Along with the new class, our hero received a new passive skill, Heavenly Palate, which allowed him to discover and sense the hidden flavors of food. Heavenly Grind, which increased the chance of dropping high-quality items and ingredients. What an unexpected twist for our hero. Just a short while ago the hunger and food mechanics in the game annoyed him, and now with getting this class his entire gameplay will be tied to it. Since he received an active skill, Heavenly Cooking, which allowed him to create incredible dishes, which will surpass all ordinary dishes in their performance and effects. After reading everything that was shown by the information window, he realized that his class was similar to being a chef. But it didn't end there. In the next window with a class quest appeared in front of him. Now his main task in the game was to find out the truth about Gourmet King. This legend was spreading around the world of Fate, but no one could find out its origin and the truth about it. Only the hero who was a Heavenly Gourmet could do it. The system warned that no one could predict what the truth of this legend would bring, but it was certain that the history of the Fate world would be in the hands of our hero. But all these high-minded words didn't bother our hero. What really made him tense up was the difficulty and quest rewards that were listed as immeasurable. Did all this really mean that the entire history of the Fate world was in his hands? Booting into the game, our protagonist appeared in the same place. After materializing the sword, he first decided to calculate what he needed to do. The buffalo's level was over 20, while his level was still 18. In order to hunt a higher level monster, the most effective way was to be in a group. Standing in front of the big angry bull that was standing in a stance as if preparing to attack, X added to himself that all the previous requirements had nothing to do with him. Looking at the bull with steam coming out of his nose and looking at him with a furious look, he wondered with a smile what the bull tasted like. Since he had only caught 10 monsters during this time, he had no choice but to continue fighting. Jumping high into the air, he swung his sword with a cry of, "Let's eat," and lunged at the innocent bull. The next moment, he struck a blow that proved critical to the bull. As he watched the bull fall to pieces, he began to receive system notifications that he had earned experience as well as meat from the bull. Taking one of the pieces, he said with a happy face, "Itadakimasu." Then he took a bite and swallowed it. The system immediately reported that the juiciness of the bull meat was absorbed by the body. He also discovered a new hidden flavor called bull meat. But the most surprising thing was not that, but the fact that his strength increased by 10 points after taking a bite. When the protagonist read the message, he decided that his ability was not balanced at all. Even though it didn't help him fight directly, and he had to learn different techniques himself, it was still a small price to pay for such an incredible ability. Looking at his status window once again, he wondered what the game developers were thinking when they created such a hidden profession. Looking at his updated stats, he sighed and said that it would take some time to get 100 on everyone, as it wasn't as easy as he thought. However, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice calling out to him. He turned around and saw a yellow-haired guy who greeted him excitedly, introduced himself as Dallas, and that he was a priest. Then he added that he had been amazed when he saw him hunting yesterday. The protagonist was a little wary of this sudden acquaintance. Though it seemed a bit strange to him, he decided to take a chance and see what this guy had to offer him. He smiled back at the guy and thanked him for his praise, then asked him if he needed anything. He asked if he could add him as a friend, as he wanted to talk to him yesterday, but couldn't because he was out. The next moment, the protagonist received a message that Dallas had sent him a friend request. It was quite an interesting offer. Priests had weak attack power, making it difficult for them to level up on their own. As a result, very few players would become high-level priests. However, if one chose the right skills and pumped the right characteristics and raised the level, a priest of that level was the choice number one for the group, just because their support skills. Realizing that the one wanted him to help him level up, X decided that he had no reason to refuse since he was not losing anything by doing so. Smiling, he replied to the one that he agreed, adding that they could hunt together next time. Smiling happily, Dallas replied that he was glad, then informed him that he had some herb-gathering skills. He raised his staff to the top. The orb at the end immediately glowed with a bright green light, which in the next moment began to surround the protagonist, who was surprised by the unusual sensations spreading throughout his body. The system window immediately displayed a message that his inventory had been boosted, while the duration of the boost was 3 hours. Looking at his inventory and finding many empty cells in his inventory, X couldn't believe that he was able to get such a good boost so easily, which allowed him to kill a few more monsters before going to the city. However, the next moment he wondered if he really needed to go there. Turning to the priest who was about to leave, he asked if he could help him. He turned around and asked in surprise how he could help him. Taking out a bull horn from his inventory, the protagonist replied that there was nothing difficult in his request, because he only had to help him carry and collect the horns. Dallas was a bit puzzled by such a strange request. Let's go forward for a while. Standing next to the bull that had fallen to the ground after his sword strike, the protagonist told himself that it was the last one, and that he had already killed 100 in total. The next moment, the system sent a message saying that he had been promoted to the rank of Fearless Adventurer, which reduced his damage by 5% and also increased his damage output by 5% when fighting monsters of a higher level than him. After reading this information, he thought to himself that it wasn't that much. Looking at the priest who was surprised to see him collecting materials and putting them in his inventory, asking why he needed so many horns, he said to himself that even though it was not the priest's intended use, it was still quite useful. Stashing his sword in his inventory, he added that this situation was not harmful to him. Besides, it might even do him some good if he could connect with him. Heading into the city, and following his new comrade, Dallas also thought that he should not miss his chance, because to meet a player who would take a weak priest like him to his team again was very small. The kindness of the guy who had taken him in had impressed him a lot. And he was determined that when he became strong, he would also help the newcomers. Dallas was so much on fire about it that his blazing aura was felt even by X walking ahead of him, making him think that something felt a bit sneaky lurking behind him. After a while, they came to the town. As they were about to part ways, the protagonist thanked his new partner for helping him today. He replied that he was happy to help, adding that he should let him know if he needed any more help. Grabbing the doorknob leading into the store, X to himself that it was time to clear his inventory. As soon as he entered, he was immediately greeted by a shopkeeper he already knew, whose mood seemed a bit odd to the protagonist. As he approached the counter, he greeted Mr. Rubin back, saying that he had come to sell something. Seeing that the man did indeed look depressed, the protagonist asked the man what was wrong, adding that he noticed that he was not in his usual mood. The man lowered his head and clenched his hand into a fist and replied that nothing was wrong. However, after a second pause, he raised his head and looked at the protagonist and asked if he could spare him some time, as he had something important to tell him. Sitting at the table in the living room, X turned to the shopkeeper, who was sitting opposite in a depressed state, and asked him something he wanted to tell him. The latter replied that he was going to tell him a secret that only he would know. He then proceeded to tell him his problem, which began with the top management threatening him with unreasonable delivery terms, such as the rare deerskin he had bought last time. This time, however, the required item was beyond his capabilities. Besides, today was the last day, and if they couldn't fulfill the requirements on time, their store would most likely be closed. Looking at the protagonist, he added that as he should know, Narville was a town for beginners, and because of that, most adventurers would quickly move on to the hunting grounds. With tears in his eyes he said that because of this there were no players who would hunt the powerful Narville ox, and none of them had ever brought 100 ox horns at once. And he couldn't imagine where he could get so many horns in such a short period of time. The next moment, the protagonist rumbled to put down the ox horn, asking the man for the kind of horns he needed. Upon seeing the horn, the man was shocked, unable to believe his eyes. But what made him even more shocked was the next words of the guy who said that he had 100 horns. X also added with a warm smile on his face that he owed Mr. Rubin even more, and would always be grateful to him. The same with tears of joy in his eyes sincerely thanked the protagonist, saying that thanks to the horns that he brought, he will be able to save his store. The protagonist replied with a smile that he wouldn't want the store to close. The next moment the system sent him a message that his reputation had increased by 10 points. Mr. Rubin, on the other hand, continued to thank X, saying that from now on he promises to pay him the maximum price for his goods, and also promised that he would share the latest information with him. The shopkeeper's words of information interested the protagonist. After all, if he wanted to defeat the traders alone, he needed information that they did not possess. Thanking the man for the generous offer, he said goodbye that they would see each other later. Some time later our protagonist arrived at the central square of the city, where there was a restaurant Kaimus. The kitchen of the restaurant was very noisy, as everyone was doing their own thing. In front of the protagonist stood a large middle-aged man, who possessed golden hair and was also wearing a blue apron. He was none other than the owner of Kailan restaurant who had the profession of chef. Turning to X, he asked if he wanted to learn cooking from him. To which our protagonist replied in a firm voice that he did, for he had heard that he was the best chef in Narville. Some time ago at Mr. Rubin's store. With his hands folded in front of him, X turned to the storekeeper and asked him if he knew where there was a good chef in town. To which he replied that he knew one, but that he was so eccentric that an ordinary man could not even talk to him. Even so, he remained the best cook in all of Narville. Worried that X would not be kicked out as soon as he arrived, Mr. Rubin said he would write him a letter of recommendation. Clenching his huge hand into a fist, and looking contemptuously at the guy in front of him, Carlin asked who he was, and that he had come to learn how to cook normal food, not the garbage that people eat every day. This treatment discouraged the protagonist a bit, as the cook was even more harsh than he thought. However, there was no way to retreat, as this was his only chance, which he did not want to miss. Taking off his shoulder pad, he asked for permission to prove that he was worthy of learning from him. The protagonist was confident in his cooking skills, and was now ready to make him change his mind by showing him everything he had learned in his 2 years of working at the restaurant. Ignoring the annoyed words of the cook who still didn't like the idea, X stood in front of the table. Looking at the ingredients, he noted that they were different from the ingredients of the real world, so his task was to try to combine similar things as much as he could. First he decided to use milk to get rid of the smell of raw meat. The next step was to spread the meat evenly on a mixture of flour and eggs. And the final step was to fry it all in oil at a medium temperature of 170 degrees. Seeing the way the guy was cooking, Carlin irritatedly said that it was just normal fried food. Hearing that, X told himself that the guy would surely change his mind when he added the ingredient that would put this dish together. That ingredient wasn't available in the real world, and it was called Heavenly Touch. Behind the protagonist appeared the image of the hermit he had met earlier. And the very next moment after activating the skill, the dish glowed with a bright golden light, while he himself seemed to have an epiphany. Watching it all with his glowing golden eyes, he wondered if he was the only one who had seen it. Deciding not to dwell on it, he began to vigorously move his hands around the dish. Thanks to the skill, his hands could do what he lacked in his cooking skills. As he finished cooking the dish, he made a final sweep of his hand, causing the dish to glow even brighter. The cooking was finished, and a bowl of golden chicken legs appeared in front of the cook, making him hungry just looking at them. Smelling the aroma and seeing a dish unknown to them before, the other cooks were shocked and drool instantly flowed from their mouths. Watching this with a satisfied smile, X told himself that their reaction was expected since the dish was prepared with the heavenly touch. Even with all his skepticism, Carlin looked at the dish and noted that it looked rather unusual. With a thoughtful hand resting on his chin, he added that he had definitely prepared an interesting dish. However, the only way to be sure was to taste it, which he did. The next moment, his eyes widened in surprise. Memories of when he had tasted divine food once before immediately appeared in his mind. The sensations and emotions he experienced back then were forever etched in his memory. Seeing the strange behavior of their boss, the other employees started to ask him if he was all right. Suddenly tears streamed down Carlin's face. All those who had known him for a long time were shocked as they could not believe that he could cry. So they started asking him again if he was okay. The next moment his fist hit the table with force. Then he ordered everyone to shut up in an irritated voice, adding that they were closing early today. For the first time in a long time, Carlin's restaurant closed earlier than usual. Sitting at a table across from the main character, the Carlin chef asked him if his name was X. To which he replied that it was. After these words there was an awkward pause at the table. After a moment it was broken by Carlin, asking the protagonist if he had heard of the Gourmet King before. Such a question puzzled X a bit. After thinking about it, he replied that he had indeed heard of him somewhere before. Hearing the guy's answer, the man said that then he must have also heard of the legend that said that he appeared when the kingdom of Arba was founded, where he had left his legend. However, one day he disappeared somewhere without a trace. Hearing this, the protagonist wondered if the old man he had met earlier could be the king of gourmets. Carlin went on to say that he could feel his touch in his food, but added that it was probably because his recipes had spread throughout the world. The protagonist only smiled in response, musing to himself that he was just doing the same thing he did at his regular job. Taking his glass and looking at it glumly, Carlin said that he believed that those who knew the Gourmet King's recipes should also learn his story. He began his story by saying that 300 years ago, it was the Gourmet King who founded the kingdom of Arba. These words struck X so hard that he jumped up from the table and exclaimed in amazement. 300 years ago, the plains of Arba. Being a traveler, the king of the gourmets came to these plains where at that time there was absolutely nothing. And seeing the beauty and fertility of these places, he decided to build a kingdom for his people and call it the Kingdom of Arba. According to his plan, this kingdom was to be a paradise for his family and his people. One day, however, he suddenly disappeared. The empty throne was immediately taken over by Lars Loren, who was the right hand of the Gourmet King. With power in his hands, he decided to execute all the servants who had served the past king. After hearing the chief's story, X was very impressed with how amazing the Gourmet King was. He was able to almost single-handedly establish an entire kingdom. But what bothered him the most was why such an amazing man had given him his powers. Clenching his hand into a fist, he wondered if it was his responsibility to restore the kingdom as well as its recipes. Did he really trust him that much? But he also realized that for a newcomer like him, no wonder everything seemed so abnormal to him. Turning his gaze to Carlin, he wondered if he knew the history of the Gourmet King. Could it mean that he also knew his recipes? And since he didn't know that, the best solution was to act now. Turning to Chief Carlin, he told the man that he knew that his words were hard to believe, then informed him that he was actually a descendant of the Gourmet King. After saying that, the man's eyebrows furrowed even more, and he asked the guy what he was talking about. Then pointing a finger at the protagonist, he said that if he wanted him to believe that he was the heir of the Gourmet King. He turned around and went to the table and added that he had to prove it. Carlin went to the table and took a knife and started cooking, showing his masterful skills at it. Continuing to cook the dish on the fire, he said that if he really was his heir, he would have to feel the secret of his dish at once. Placing a dish in front of the protagonist that smelled very nice and looked very attractive, he said that this was the dish his grandfather had served to the Gourmet King himself many years ago. Taking a spoonful of the food, X brought it to his mouth. After eating just a spoonful, he was amazed at the flavor of the dish. The system immediately sent a message that a hidden flavor, memory stew, had been detected in the food. Furthermore, the experience that was condensed into memory stew was internalized in his body. In addition, a notification window appeared in front of him, informing him that he had obtained the Kalshmar the Shield ability, which paved the way for him to fully master the art of shield techniques. With this ability, when he blocked a shield strike, the opponent's strike would be reduced by 30%. Also, when attacking a monster with his shield, there was a 50% chance of victory. In addition, his attack power is directly proportional to his defense when attacking with a shield. After reading the information about the new ability, the protagonist was a bit surprised, and he immediately had an idea. He asked Carlin if his great-grandfather was once called Kalshmar the Shield. When he heard this, he shouted excitedly how he knew. Adding that did he really only realize it by eating stew? Then saying that his great-grandfather had told him that the king of gourmets was also able to realize things just by tasting them. Realizing that the guy in front of him was indeed the chosen one, he excitedly grabbed X's hand and said that he was very happy that finally after 300 years there was a successor to the Gourmet King. As soon as Carlin calmed down and came to his senses, the protagonist asked him if he could teach him the recipe he had taken from the Gourmet King. Carlin replied that he would like to do so, but he had never prepared the full recipe, as it was too difficult for him to get the key ingredient. And the difficulty was that for the full recipe, he had to get the meat of a black cave bear, which was the main boss in the northern zone, which could only mean one thing: he was strong. Chief Carlin, realizing that the guy was going on a dangerous mission, gave him a stormtrooper armor, telling him that he would definitely help him. Putting on the armor and armed with a sword, X thanked him, thinking happily that he had managed to get a full outfit so easily. However, the surprises didn't end there, and in the next moment, Carlin handed him a bottle of potion, which looked very expensive, and also shone with a bright light. A system window appeared in front of the protagonist, stating that this potion was called Lower Flames Essence. This flask contained the essence of the tribe. If you soaked your equipment with it, it would have the properties of the fire element. In addition, the bonus was low-level fire damage. This was just in time, as the monsters in the north were resistant to cold but weak against fire. To motivate him even more, Carlin added that if he managed to hunt the bear successfully, he could teach him the recipe, and after preparing it, they could try it together. The next moment a system window appeared in front of X again, displaying a task called Carlin's Dream. It was reported that the latter's dream was to finish the recipe of the King of Gourmets, which he himself could not do due to low combat skills. The main character's task was to help him realize his dream, for which he was to receive Carlin's restaurant VIP pass as a reward. After activating the Flame Essence potion, which was immediately applied to his equipment, X clenched his hand into a fist and resolutely said that he would definitely realize his dream. Some time later in the northern snowy fields. Walking through the mountainous terrain covered with snow, the protagonist dressed in a long cloak, exhaling steam from his mouth, annoyed that it was really cold in the north. Seeing the white wolf in front of him, and taking out his sword from his inventory, he told himself that without Carlin's equipment and fire essence he would have a hard time traveling here. Swinging the sword and chopping off the wolf's head, he immediately received a notification from the system that he had earned experience. Looking at his status window, he was surprised at the amount of experience he was able to gain by hunting in the snow fields. The fact that he was able to reach level 34 made him wonder if he could defeat a bear at that level, maybe with a critical hit. But his musings were interrupted by someone's desperate voice calling for help. Turning around, he saw a short human figure nearby, approached at high speed by a white wolf. Looking closely at the figure, X realized that it was the figure of a child, who judging from the screams was very frightened, and had no strength to resist the wolf. Maliciously opening its toothy maw, the wolf lunged at the boy, who closed his eyes and screamed in panic to get away from him. However, the wolf's maw failed to reach its goal, as its neck suddenly separated from its body. Standing in front of the puzzled boy and holding his sword in his hand, the protagonist asked the boy in a relaxed voice if he was okay. The boy stammered as he looked at the dead wolf who had already started to disappear. When he came to his senses, the boy began to thank X from the bottom of his heart, saying that he had only survived thanks to his help. He then introduced himself as Ron Tyler, eldest son of the noble Tyler family of Veneta. These words surprised the protagonist very much. Everyone in the world of fate has their own status, and not only royal tasks and noble NPCs become more difficult, because they even give out large rewards corresponding to their status. Smiling back at the boy and introducing himself as X, the protagonist said that he was glad to meet him. To which the boy replied that it was nice to meet him too. Wrapping himself more tightly in his cloak, Ron asked X if he would like to stay at his mansion for a while. He added that he would like to tell him more about their situation, but because of their family's pride, they couldn't talk about it just like that. Hearing the boy's words, the protagonist was interested, and he was cold and had plenty of time to find a new recipe. So he told the boy that he didn't mind and told him to show him the way. The boy nodded happily in response. After a while they arrived at the Tyler's mansion, which appeared to be in a very abandoned state. Entering the building, and following the boy down a similarly unkept corridor, the walls of which were cracked in many places, X wondered if this was really where the nobles had lived. Passing a portrait of a gray-haired middle-aged man dressed in formal clothes, Ron called him father and said he was back. Passing by the kitchen, the protagonist also noted that among other things, those had also run out of food. Suddenly, a golden-haired woman peeked out from one side, greeting the boy. Holding her hand was an equally golden-haired little girl. Turning to Ron, X asked him if he was the only visitor, to which he replied that he was, since it was just him, his sick mom, and his sister. Hearing this, the protagonist asked if he could use their kitchen. This question surprised the boy, but he still gave his consent. After a while in the kitchen, Ron watched with open mouth drooling as X prepared the food. Stirring everything and roasting it on the fire, he said that since he didn't have many ingredients, it wouldn't take long to cook. When everyone was seated at the table where the food he had prepared was, he suggested that they start eating, saying that he would also like to learn more about them. The protagonist introduced himself as a famous gourmet. However, no one answered him, as everyone was busy devouring the food, and after a couple of minutes the pot in the middle of the table was already empty. Seeing this, X thought to himself that they must have really been starving for days. After some more time, everyone finished eating. Turning to X, Ron said that he couldn't believe that he was serving such a great guest, then thanking him for the delicious food, he said that he swore on his family's honor that he would never forget his favor. To which the latter replied that he was glad they had enjoyed it. The little girl with a happy face and holding a spoon in her hands, happily said that she would never forget him either, as his food was very tasty. Hearing this, the main character couldn't help but smile. Then Ron also added that their mother was also grateful for such a delicious meal, to which he replied that there was nothing special about his food. When the boy had finished his pleasantries, he said in a firm voice that before they got down to business he would like to tell him the reason why the Tyler house had fallen down. And he began by saying that the reason their family had lived in the cold northern mountains for generations was because the mansion was connected to a dungeon that was called the Graveyard of Strange Branches. The dungeon was crawling with many monsters, but their family had a clue that had been passed down from generation to generation. It said that there was treasure at the end of the dungeon. His father was one of those who believed in these words, so he gathered a squad to fight the monsters in the dungeon. They even hired mercenaries, spent a huge amount of money to equip them, and spent decades preparing and fighting. However, despite the amount of monsters they killed and the number of floors they traveled through, they gained nothing. The strange thing was that the monsters in this dungeon didn't even drop the usual accessories. And as a result, after spending all their energy and money on all of this, they naturally fell into disrepair. In addition, their father eventually died on one of the raids. After finishing his story, Ron said with firm conviction that he wanted to prove that the Tyler family legends were not lies, and that his father was not wrong to follow them either. Turning to X, he said that he would like to ask him to explore the dungeon again. In front of the protagonist suddenly appeared a system window with a mission, which was called Legend of the Tyler Family. The conditions to finish the mission were to explore the dungeon. The difficulty of the mission was C, while the reward was a trusted relationship with the Tyler household. After reading the conditions, X couldn't help but smile, as although the reward for completion was a bit disappointing, but the experience for going through the dungeon alone was a win-win. Therefore, he immediately agreed to help the boy. As he walked down the steps to the dungeon, he thought about how this game was different from what he had played before, because since the map was much larger, it was much harder to find the dungeon. In addition, it was almost impossible to go through the dungeons alone, because the dungeons found immediately monopolized by different guilds, and the fact that he was able to find a hidden dungeon was a huge stroke of luck. Suddenly, behind the protagonist, the head of a skeleton dressed in a helmet appeared. However, in the next moment, he cut off his head in a split second, thinking to himself that if the monsters were even at the entrance to the dungeon, then he will not be bored here. As soon as the skeleton dissolved, X immediately received a notification from the system that his level had risen. Seeing this, he was surprised at the amount of experience he got for killing a normal skeleton, as he got much more experience than he usually got from fighting outside. However, there was no real prey to eat, so he decided to move on, as he needed to keep his hunger in check. After 5 hours of passing the dungeon, in front of the protagonist finally appeared Graveyard of Strange Branches, which according to information from the system window was the boss of this dungeon. He looked a bit like Groot, but he was much uglier, plus he possessed some magic, which he would next release straight into X. However, despite its power, it never managed to reach the guy's body. Because in the next moment, he effortlessly blocked the attack with his shield, which gave him 30% protection when blocked with his shield. The ugly Groot cosplayer let out a furious roar. However, he didn't have time to get angry at all, as the very next moment X pushed himself off the ground, blocking 2 more magic attacks flying at him. He jumped high into the air and swung his sword above him, about to deliver the decisive blow. With his eyes burning golden light, he fiercely struck the boss. In the next instant, shining golden streaks of light appeared on the boss's body. This was a victory. As soon as the body of the defeated boss began to dissolve, X immediately received notifications that he had leveled up and also cleared the dungeon. While he was standing in front of the crater that was left after the monster, he again received a notification that he had received the title, Solo Clearer, which he received for being able to single-handedly clear the dungeons of Tyler Mansion. This title increased all stats by 5% and also reduced damage by 10, as long as he cleared the dungeon alone. Throwing the sword on his shoulder, X told himself that he would need this title since he would probably be entering dungeons alone many more times. However, even after defeating the boss and clearing the dungeons, he still hadn't found any treasure or anything like that, which could only mean that the legend was a lie. But suddenly an idea popped into his head. Leaning over the ground, he used the Heavenly Grind skill, and in the next instant, the system reported that he had found an item. The item was a branch called Branch of Pure Spirit. It had a unique quality and could create a flame that ignited the spirit. The holy flame lasts semi-permanently. The special effect was that it reacted to darkness. Looking at the burning branch, which could serve as an excellent torch, the protagonist noted that he had no idea what effect the holy flame had. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a wall that, when he shone the torch on it, began to glow in some places. Interested in this, he stepped closer. The next moment a sign appeared saying that the sacred flame had begun to react to the darkness.